Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Jacob Shapiro podcast. I am really happy to welcome onto the show today Tobias Harris, not the underachieving NBA star, but rather a leading expert on Japanese politics. He's the founder and principal of Japan Foresight LLC, a Japan-focused political risk advisory firm. He is also the author of the iconoclast Shinzo Abe and the New Japan. We talk about it a little bit in the conversation, and I have a link to it in the show notes. He put out that biography of Abe the day before Abe resigned as prime minister and before Abe was then eventually assassinated down the road. So a really, really interesting read, especially in the context of things happening in real time. I have said this a few times on the podcast. I find Japan to be arguably the country that is hardest to get real insight about in the West. Everybody covers China because of how important China is and how much people are interested in China. And China, in some ways, is more outward facing. It drank the globalization Kool-Aid. Japan is much more internally focused, and I think there's a real dearth of quality analysis in English about what's going on in Japan, which is why I was so excited to get introduced to Tobias. I've been following his work for some time and really happy to have him come on. So thank you to Tobias for coming on. Thank you, cousin Marco, for introducing us. Listeners, if you want to talk to me about anything you have heard on the podcast, you can email me at jacob@cognitive.investments. Otherwise, take care of the people that you love. Cheers and see you out there. Tobias, it's so nice to have you on the podcast. We're recording here on Halloween in the United States. The U.S. election will have happened by the time that people listen to this podcast, but the Japanese election will not have happened. And in some ways, it's the more interesting one to me. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Jacob. It's really great to be here to chat.
Tobias wrote an incredible biography of Shinzo Abe, and I want to get to it because I have so many questions. Also, your timing on writing that book. I mean, you could call it perfect or completely imperfect, depending on what your point of view is, but you definitely sort of had some interesting timing there. But in the midst of all that, we've had the biggest change in Japanese politics since 2009, maybe since before then, with the results of the Diet election last week and what's coming up here. So I'm guessing that a lot of our listeners are not focusing on Japanese politics and the nitty gritty. So why don't I just start with a pretty simple question? What has happened in Japan over the last couple weeks, and why is it such a change in the general trajectory of Japanese politics?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's an exciting moment in that, you really are now in uncharted waters for Japan. I mean, we've gotten used to Japan being pretty predictable, pretty stable, and we are now in an era of anything but. You do not have, where it looks like we are now heading into a situation where you're going to have a LDP-led minority government, depending on the tolerance and cooperation of one or more opposition parties, when it comes to voting for key legislation. No, I don't think anyone really knows how this is going to work. We've never really seen something like this where, the LDP will be in charge, but will not have the working majority it needs to conduct the business of governing. And, it really does mark the end of Abe politics. We got used to this idea of top-down leadership that could do what it wants, with strong legislative majorities, with really a lot of power concentrated in the prime minister's office. And that just is not going to be the case anymore. It's going to be more diffuse, more negotiation, more compromise. And there are real stakes here because, with the transition possibly to, certainly to a new U.S. presidential administration, one way or another, depending on who wins, it can go, the outcomes for Japan could be very different. Lots of questions about the direction of the global economy, lots of questions about Japan's security environment. I mean, there are real stakes to Japan, maybe being more inward looking, a little more uncertain about the role it's able to play in the world. And that really, there will be impacts for Japan not having a strong, decisive leadership at this time.
Well, and also a shift away, it seems, from two-party system in Japan. So, I mean, there's 5 different parties that have significant blocks of seats in the Diet. Is that normal? Because I sort of had the sense that Japan had moved in more of a two-party direction. But if you look at these election results, it looks like the complete opposite. It looks like multi-party democracy is live and well there.
Well, so, I mean, from 2000 or so to 2012, you did have really the emergence of what looked like two-party democracy. So you had the LDP, you had the Democratic Party of Japan. Democratic Party of Japan, after, a series of kind of two steps forward, one step back elections, finally wins in 2009. Things really go wrong during its time in power. LDP comes back. And what has happened since 2012 has been the term in Japanese basically means the one strong, many weak party system. So,
Hmm.
the Democratic Party of Japan and its successor parties basically uh, completely spun their wheels after 2012. They went nowhere. They really had struggled to get public support. Really couldn't win anything. And so you had kind of multi parties, and now it's still kind of a situation. I mean, the weirdest thing about this election that happened is that almost every party lost in some way, um, even the ones that gained seats. And I mean, there was probably one unambiguous winner, which is the Democratic Party for the People, which we can certainly talk about more, which is going to really be, um, really is in a position to um, determine whether the LDP is actually able to make this minority government situation work. I mean, and they gained like 4 million votes. They quadrupled their seat total from 7 to 28. I mean, so they're the one party that I think unambiguously performed well. But every other party in some ways kind of spun its wheels, didn't really um, dramatically. I mean, the Constitutional Democrats, the largest opposition party, increased its seat total, but its vote total only increased by roughly 1 million votes. So this was not like an overwhelming acclamation of, okay, the Constitutional Democrats are ready to govern again. This was that strategically enough voters stayed home, enough voters came out, and it just kind of worked out in their favor. But it was not necessarily this overwhelming endorsement. And of course, the LDP lost a ton of seats, so they unambiguously lost the election. Um, it's just, yeah, it is a much more messy system. Not quite back to two parties yet.
Yeah. Well, and to me, one of the things that really stuck out was the turnout rate was what, around 55%? I mean, an
Oh,
incredibly
it was
low
lower.
turnout. Oh, it was
Lower.
lower.
It was 55% in 2021, and it actually ended up being around, it was 53 something or other. So,
Oh, geez.
I mean, so that actually is really the key number, and I'm glad you brought that up because when the Democratic Party of Japan took power in 2009, it did so largely because 69% of voters,
Hmm.
and it was seen as this, you know almost like a, we want to be part of this moment. And so they attracted, I think, a lot of people who might otherwise have stayed home because they wanted to, vote for the winners and, be part of the historic change of ruling party in Japan. And that didn't happen this time. You still had a lot of people sort of disaffected with the system, staying home, opting out, not really turning out for anyone. And so that, I mean, that really is in some ways underlying all of this, is this disaffection and dissatisfaction with the choices the Japanese political system is presenting voters.
Yeah, well, so I'll ask you the impossible question, which is why are the Japanese feeling that way? I mean, we could go through and check off all the statistics that people normally do, and I'll do it. Fertility rates at 1.2, population is declining 5.6% from the previous year. Debt to GDP is 255%, or probably more than that at this point. Inflation is rising. Rice prices are up 62% year on year. My God, like when you think about how important rice is in Japanese politics. But on the flip side of that, like it does feel like there have been changes in Japan. Like wages are going up, equities are coming back. Finally breached the 1989 levels. Growth has been relatively good. So, what do you think? Or what do you attribute the disaffection of Japanese voters to? Is it really just the corruption scandals in the post-Abe governments, or is there something deeper here?
Um, well, so I mean, I think it's been an accumulation over time. That I think this really uh, I mean, and frankly, the public was really kind of frustrated during the Abe years. I mean, turnout really plummeted, in 2012, and really has never recovered from that. And
Hmm.
reached a record low of around 52% in 2014. And so, in a lot of there was a lot of um, voter disaffection already during those years, and just a frustration with the choices. That they not neither uh, opposition nor government really doing enough to kind of address public concerns. And I think what grew during the Abe years, you know, r- yes, like some people did very well out of the Abe years. I think people saw, the markets were up, corporate profits were up, wages starting to creep up during the Abe years. I think actually one thing that happened during the Abe years was young voters generally favored the LDP because they were facing the best job markets they had, had in decades, and things look good for them. Um, but over time, I mean, I think there was, it's just a series of things. You had influence peddling during the Abe years. You after Abe was assassinated, you had the Unification Church scandal, and the LDP
Mhm.
being exposed as having made these deals with basically what people call an antisocial organization. Um, you had cost of living issues with kind of post COVID cost of living issues, not unlike other democracies. And then and corruption on top of that. You just add it all up, and it's just this mix of um, the LDP seemingly disconnected from the daily concerns of voters, doing basically taking care of itself, with these scandals, and doing whatever it wanted to stay in power, um, while not really making headway in addressing kind of what people were really feeling. And I think more recently too, the yen's weakness and what that revealed about um, Japan's kind of relative wealth or lack thereof, and feeling
Mhm.
overrun by tourists, and feeling, okay, well, it used to be that we could, take a nice trip abroad and, not feel impoverished. And I just, I know lots of, researchers and people coming here and visiting, and, hearing their complaints about how much it cost them to, just get a hotel and what airfare, that, I
Mhm.
think everyone just sort of, it was in their face in a way, maybe, um, that it hadn't been, and really pressed home that your quality of life issues were taking a backseat to some other things. And so,
Mhm.
um, I think that was sort of the perfect storm that really hit the LDP over the last year or so.
And I guess I can see why they chose Shigeru Ishiba to try and save them here, because I mean I've just been doing a little bit of reading about him either in your Substack or in other areas, and I have to say I haven't liked a political figure more than him in recent years when reading about him. I mean, he just seems totally awesome, and not only that, there's so much material out there. He's like written entire treatises about Japanese foreign policy. So there's no ambiguity, no ambiguousness about what does he think and how is he going to position Japan vis-a-vis China or vis-a-vis the United States. Um, and he talks about, it's not the metropolises that change the country, it's the people of the countryside. And he has a reputation for sticking up and being on the outside of the LDP. None of that seemed to matter. It didn't translate into anything for the LDP. It didn't get people out to vote, and it didn't get them out to vote for the LDP in general. Do you think that he survives as prime minister? Is it just going to be a really short-lived thing? And if he does survive, do you think that he has the capacity or the ability to change things? Because it does seem like he's charismatic and he's an outsider and he has different priorities, but I worry that he's too earnest and that the system is just going to swallow him up. Maybe you can give me some hope.
Um, I wish I could. I mean, I think he certainly has weathered the near term crisis. I mean, I think when the Diet reconvenes in November and has to pick a new prime minister, I think he will continue to be the prime minister. But beyond that, his well of political capital does not look uh, very full. And I think it's this is going to be a difficult situation. Managing running a minority government, depending on negotiations with not I shouldn't say coalition partners, with opposition parties that are extremely wary of being bound at all to the LDP. That they don't want to be bound to this party that's unpopular. They don't want to be bound um, to a party that has a history of swallowing up opposition parties. And so you have opposition parties that are going to be very happy to grab concessions wherever they can, but they're not going to be giving a whole lot in exchange. So he is not he is not in a great situation. There are upper house elections next year. The likelihood that the LDP is not going to want to contest those elections with him as the party's leader are not. I would say they're I don't think his chances right now of leading the LDP in the election are great now, and I think by spring of next year, um, it seems very unlikely that the LDP will still want him running the show. But well, there's a lot of time, a lot can happen, a lot of time between now and then. I mean, I think also, I don't think he expected to win. I don't think a lot of people expected him to win the leadership election last month, and the way in which he won, I think means, well, one, it exposed that the LDP is actually really deeply divided along, basically along ideological grounds. That you almost have a, um, pro Abe, we got to continue everything Abe did, without changing anything, versus we need to move past that and, revise and reform. And, whether you want to call that kind of pro or anti Abe wings, I mean, like that essentially is where the division is. And, um, but Ishiba also needed the support of former Prime Minister Kishida to win, and so in the end, he basically has decided to continue everything that Kishida was doing, which a lot of ways, Kishida was continuing what Abe was doing. So, I mean, that really, I think, was maybe um, some of the problem that Ishiba had after taking over was that it became clear that whatever independence he had, whatever, no matter what his political brand was before he became prime minister, um, he was not going to be free to live up to that and to put that into practice. That he just was going to be too compromised, um, too constrained by the conditions that shaped his victory, and therefore, I mean, it was just going to be very hard to um, build a strong popular mandate for himself.
Yeah, he seems like a tragic figure. In some ways, Biden also strikes me as a tragic figure, like, having discrete ideas, but not coming to power at a time or at an age when things allowed you to do things the way that you wanted to. Well, what does that mean then for what we should think about Japan going forward? Because it seems, does this mean actual changes in Japanese either foreign policy or trade policy or monetary policy? Or are we really just talking about the machinery of state is gummed up and we're just going to have a revolving door of leaders until some coalition is able to emerge to put things together? And until the revolving door stops, like you said, it's probably whoever comes in is going to come in with all these great ideas. And then they're like, well, I can't do anything. So we will continue doing whatever was done before. And in the meantime, sort of fighting behind the scenes. Like, how do you see that reflecting in Japan's actual policies, whether domestic or foreign?
Yeah, I mean, I think until until you have a government with a working majority, um, a lot of the work of government is just going to be running negotiations um, with other parties and just trying to find the lowest common denominator that gets you a majority in favor of a budget or in favor of a bill. And that's an uncomfortable situation to be in, particularly given what we've all gotten used to since 2012, where Japan actually has been more decisive than ever. Used to be, Japan can't decide anything, Japan can't act, and that has not really been the case for the last 12 years. Japan actually showed um, a real ability to make decisions, um, to act, to articulate, a policy, to, really set an agenda internationally. All of that, I think, is going to be much more difficult in these circumstances. And, probably it seems like the only thing maybe that the LDP and some of its negotiating partners will agree on is increasing spending. And so, if you expect, you know, more deficits, more debt, that seems like a good bet right now. Um, but otherwise, I mean, this is not, the kind of um, consensus around, maybe more fiscal discipline doesn't seem to be happening. Um, I think there's going to be a lot more leeway for the bureaucracy to make policy, which can be a good or a bad thing depending on which part of the bureaucracy and what the issue at hand is. Um, on foreign policy, I mean, I think Ishiba is still finding his footing, and there's just the inward lookingness is really going to mean that just a lot that sometimes I think foreign policy and personal diplomacy and summitry is all it might feel like a luxury at times when there's just work to do to just manage um, this domestic situation.
Yeah. Let's zoom out a little bit because, I've talked on this podcast many times about how optimistic I am about Japan and how I think about Japan being at a historical inflection point. And you're somebody who focuses just on Japan and in some ways has devoted his life to understanding Japan better. And I wonder when somebody, gets you in front of them and says, well, how can you think that Japan is going to do anything because the population is shrinking and they don't have a military and they're completely dependent on the United States and China's going to swallow them up at a very high level? What makes you optimistic about Japan? Because I think the general narrative is very much that Japan is sort of what the future looks like for many Western countries with declining demographics, and that is a future that is not good. So when somebody gives you that spiel of statistics and things like that, how do you normally respond?
Well, I mean, I think for starters, I mean, that there is a lot of bottom up change happening in the country. And that, I mean, I think that's first and foremost that, um, the people are responding, you know, individuals, workers, businesses are reacting, adapting, um, on their own, and they don't need the government to tell them how to do it. This is not about policy that, that everyone is, um, they're not standing around waiting for the Japanese government to figure out how to respond to the circumstances that you mentioned. So,
Mhm.
um, I mean, that's just, look at the evidence of your eyes that Japan, um, is waking up in important ways. I mean, I think the other, just to the broader kind of geopolitical shifts that, um, Japan still has a lot of assets that that will make it, well, one that make it, I think, a compelling alternative to China in Asia. It does have rule of law. It is state. I mean, relatively speaking, it is politically stable, regardless of the current moment. Um, it's not polarized. This is not, like the kind of political um, situation that we're talking about. It is noteworthy that we're not talking about, there's two sides that can't agree on anything. I mean, the one party that did the best in this past election was, a very pragmatic, technocratic conservative party. You've had sort of more like right wing populist parties that have tried to enter the scene, and they really no, they're not really going anywhere. And so there's, I think, a level headedness. There's a pragmaticness that is shaping, I think, how the political system is responding to the challenges Japan is facing. There's the one thing that I thought um, is probably most important about Abenomics, but maybe is not always appreciated, was sort of a willingness to experiment and a willingness to kind of try new policies and to see what works. And I think that spirit generally has continued. I think, Kishida was also continuing to try to do that, sort of acknowledging, we live in an era where kind of the assumptions about how the global economy works from the post Cold War era aren't really operating anymore. We need to adapt. We need to, try new industrial policies. We need to be willing to try new things. I think that spirit is very much, um, very deeply ingrained in the political system, and that, the fact that Japan has been dealing with these problems for as long as it has now, um, there's sort of an expectation that just because you're not necessarily gonna have a final, once and for all, we figured it out, but we're gonna just sort of keep trying to manage it. We're gonna keep trying to find ways of, um, making it better, adapting to the situation, and that spirit of experimentation, I think, is fundamentally something very useful, um, and something that other democracies probably could stand to learn from.
Hmm. Um, I want to ask, I think that's a great answer, and I'm going to steal some of it the next time somebody asks me that question about why I'm so optimistic about Japan. But the next sort of level of that question that I want to ask is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's sort of historically unprecedented for China to be as strong and as strengthening as it currently is with Japan, maybe as a weaker party or a party that is not able to exert as much influence or control over what's going on in China. And Japan has reached this point, and this is true of many countries in the world, but it's true of Japan. I mean, maybe you could say South Korea, it's true of more so. But Japan is economically very dependent on China, has become very dependent on trade with China. At the same time, China is certainly its biggest national security threat. Maybe you might want to throw in North Korea, but if we're thinking about existential national security threats, it seems to me that China is the biggest one. And one of the most interesting things to me about Shinzo Abe was his ability to have both of those things at the same time, to have very good relations with Xi Jinping, and yet also to be the one saying, we have to change the constitution, we have to fight, and we have to have defense forces that are capable of doing things. How is Japan going to deal with that? And how is this bottoms up change that you're talking about? Is there skepticism about China? Is there fear about China? Is there, oh, like we can work with China? Is it China's going to collapse? Like we don't have to worry about these guys. Like the Communist Party's a house of cards. Like help me think about how China looms in the psyche of Japan.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think, I mean, you're clearly, the idea of, uh, China being relatively stronger and Japan being relatively weaker. I mean, this is a situation that hasn't it's been a few centuries since, um, that was the kind of relative balance, and so, I mean, I do think there has been a certain amount of, adjustment in Japan. Um, I think, fundamentally, I think there is the kind of realism that Abe showed about China, um, I think is pretty close to a consensus view. I mean, you have, hardliners on China. Um, you have people who are, more focused on talking with China. But I think that the ultimately what that gets you to is an understanding that, you know, they're our neighbor, they're a huge market, we have to find a way to live with them. And it's not always going to be it's not always going to be an easy thing to do. There's going to be friction. There's going to, like, they're growing and they're confident and they're throwing their elbows around, and that's going to cause difficulty in all sorts of ways. Um, and, we need to be able to defend ourselves, and we need to be negotiating from a position of strength. And, all of that is true. But fundamentally, I mean, I think the idea that, Japan has no choice but to find a way to live with China, even if it's not always comfortable, even if it's not always easy. And, and I think the notion, that you mentioned, that China might collapse, or that, that you might end up with chaos. I mean, I think that's actually, something that would be very alarming in Tokyo. That, um, the notion of, kind of an ungovernable China would be, I think that would be very, very concerning to Japan. Um, and, because of the loss of those, the loss of those markets, the whatever sort of spillover chaos that you got from that. So I don't think there's anyone really rooting for the CCP uh, to collapse by any means. I mean, in the Japanese government, I mean, I think um, they're not, maybe not the biggest fans, but also, are keenly aware that the alternatives could be a lot worse. And so, I mean, trying to live with a stronger China, um, is really, I mean, it's what everyone is focused on doing, and that can mean, um, that there's no easy answer to that. It's something that requires constant adjustment. Again, like sort of a willingness to be flexible and to respond, as circumstances change. But, fundamentally, I mean, trying to figure out a way to live with China, I think is the overwhelming consensus.
Let's stress test that idea then. So, and I don't think this is by any means a likely scenario. I'm actually on record as saying I don't think that China is going to do anything militarily about Taiwan for the rest of the decade. But let's say I'm wrong about that, and let's not even make it an invasion World War III bullshit scenario. Let's make it a. Let's say that Taiwan does something about independence that angers Beijing, and Beijing responds by blockading Taiwan and trying to interdict trade and limit trade. What does Japan do in that situation? Does it release a bunch of statements? Does it try to break the blockade? Does like how would Japan react to a situation like that where it would have to choose, where Abe's pragmatism and realism would be tested in a meaningful way?
Well, and this is a huge question, because I think, in some ways we don't know for sure. That, like they're talking, like, because, one of the things that Abe was saying, in the months before he died was, that, um, a Taiwan crisis is a Japan crisis. Well, okay, like, if that's true, well, what does that mean, and what are we prepared to do depending on the scenarios? And I think there is a greater appetite to have those discussions in Japan. I mean, I think there is, one thing that we saw during the LDP leadership election, when those debates did have a little more discussion about, well, something happened to Taiwan, and the focus ended up being, somewhat navel gazing, and that, was on how do we get Japanese nationals onto Taiwan, which is, on the list of kind of priorities in the event of a crisis, is not maybe not the highest priority issue, but there's at least, I think, um, a willingness to really recognize that, Japan is not going to be able to just kind of put its head down and sit out a a crisis. So, but I don't think we know, because I don't know if Japan really knows. I don't know if it would be sanctions. I don't, um, and some of it would depend on the United States. How does the United States respond? The idea also that Japan would be able to act kind of independently in that kind of situation, I don't think is terribly realistic. I think a lot of it really would depend on, you know, what is the U.S. doing? Um, what sort of coalition is the United States trying to put together? Is the United States actually willing to take risks on Taiwan's behalf? Which, depending on what happens next week, like the answer could be very different. So, I mean, I think I don't think Japan is at a point where they've really gamed out every scenario, have really figured out exactly what Japan will do, other than kind of reaching a point where, okay, we're not going to be able to sit it out. We need to be there and be ready to act.
Yeah, of all the things that cut against my argument of Chinese aggressiveness, I think the one that actually supports the idea that China would do something is I think the answer in Washington is the same as what you just said, which is they don't know. And if you're coming at the answer to the question with an I don't know, and China knows exactly what it's going to do, that already sets up a sort of unevenness of where strategy and tactics are going to go. Before we pivot out and talk a little bit about Shinzo Abe and the context of Japanese history, because I really do want to get to this, the last sort of foreign policy oriented question I wanted to ask you about was something I got very wrong. I thought the break in South Korean Japanese trade relations a couple of years ago was going to be the beginning chapter of a much larger book of Japan and South Korea, not necessarily falling apart, but getting further away from each other, and maybe South Korea getting sucked into if not a Chinese sphere of influence, maybe more of an independent-minded party. That has gone away, and I think when historians look back at the Biden White House, they'll have plenty of things they can write about from a dismissive point of view. But one resounding success of the Biden administration has been to get South Korea and Japan to work together again, and part of that has to go with South Korean elections. Do you think that that's durable? Because it seems to me that it is a big change in how Japan and South Korea have started to work together in meaningful ways and reverse some of the trade protectionism. You've got North Korea doing its normal crazy things and sending troops to Ukraine and cutting off the roads to South Korea. Do you think that's durable, or do you think that depending on who the next Japanese leader is, or how this revolving door of Japanese politics go, could we see a reinvigoration of the tensions between Seoul and Tokyo?
Some of it's probably more about South Korean politics. I mean, I think so much is dependent on Yoon's willingness to um, to stake a lot on improving the relationship with Japan, and he has given, in some ways, I think he has given more than Kishida gave in return, and um, how who's going to at some point Yoon's going to leave office, and who succeeds him, because the other side of the political spectrum in South Korea is not as um, satisfied with what Japan has done, how Japan has approached uh, cooperation, and is not necessarily on board with all of the things Yoon has done. And so that, I mean, that in some ways is the biggest challenge. I mean, if there was a swing more to the right in Japan, um, yes, I think that would be a stress in its own way, because the right wing, I think, um, does not buy that South Korea is fully out of China's orbit, and is going to be part of the kind of league of like-minded democracies. I mean, I think that has been a real obstacle that I think a good part of establishment opinion in Japan just doesn't trust South Korea, that they're too
Mhm.
they're too continental, they're too close to China, they're too dependent on China. Like, they're never, like, sure, they say these things, but can we really believe that they want to be oriented this way? I mean, but I mean, I do think there has been, I think, a meaningful shift in um, South Korean public opinion towards China over the last 5 or so years. In the aftermath of the THAAD boycotts and things. I mean, there was, I think, an appreciable shift. Yoon did not come out of nowhere. Um, it's just a question of um, how durable is the support for closer ties with Japan as a way to deal um, with China, with a stronger China. And
Mhm.
um, but so it might be um, it might be fragile on the South Korean side in particular. Um, and that's something to watch. I mean, there's still a few years away from another Korean presidential election. So there's more time to institutionalize things. I mean, and I think also, if you do get a second Trump administration, I mean, I think that the consequences for trilateral cooperation um, could be significant in that. Well, a couple things. I mean, one, um, I think we should remember that during the Trump administration, when South Korea and South Korea was appealing to Trump to try to resolve the bilateral dispute, and he
Yeah.
was like, "Why is everyone asking me? This is why should I be involved with this? Why like what do I have to do with this?" And so um, it is very difficult to see him being more a second Trump administration being more willing to invest time in preserving or kind of managing uh, the Japan South Korea bilateral relationship, um, and but also the possibility that um, if a second Trump administration makes South Korea feel like it can't rely on U.S. extended deterrence, and what decisions South Korea makes in response to that, and then what kind of knock-on effects does that have in Japan? Um, you know, there's a trilateral framework um, could be vulnerable in that way if basically if one at least one leg of it doubts its efficacy in the face of the challenges that you're seeing now. So particularly with North Korea. So there's a lot of question marks, I think, around what we've seen. It's not that it's going to fall apart immediately, but we could see new stressors on it in the next several years.
Well, to your point, if it is Trump and what that means for North Korea and how both Japan and South Korea are going to react to that, all things that are pretty unpredictable in that sense. Um, okay, well, before I let you out of here, I wanted to talk for at least 10 minutes or so about your book, The Iconoclast, Shinzo Abe and the New Japan. There's a picture of it behind your head, which is great, and we'll have a link to it in the show notes. I hope to one day have a picture of my book behind my head. It's not there quite yet. Got to get it out of my fingers. But you wrote this book. Abe was still prime minister and still alive. And since you published the book, Shinzo Abe had to resign due to health concerns, which is a thread throughout the book, too. It wasn't the first time that he had to resign because of his ulcerative colitis. And then he was assassinated. And I have to confess that I don't think that, I mean, I guess I'm sure it reverberated in Japan. I don't feel like for as important a historical figure as Shinzo Abe, I think will be in the future, the fact that he was gunned down in the street, I don't think it got near the amount of coverage and still does not get the same amount of coverage in the rest of the world. Because I mean, this is like the most important leader, arguably in post World War II Japan, is literally just shot in the street, and we don't mention it that much. So the first question I wanted to ask you was, how do those things change what you wrote? Do they change what you wrote? Are you already working on a chapter to update everything? Like, I'm very curious how you've metabolized the things that have happened since you put the book out.
Yeah. Well, and so the I mean, it's I mean, the timing thing with this book was so strange because, originally it was supposed to come out in the spring of 2020. The goal was, well, let's get it out before the Olympics. Everyone's going to be looking at Japan, and, there'll just be a lot of focus on who this Abe guy is. And, so that'll be timed perfectly. And then COVID first delayed the publication date to late August of 2020. And then, of course, delayed the Olympics. So, all of that was scrambled. But then it ended up coming out the day before he resigned. And so, just like a really, just a complete happenstance. But a really, really great boost of publicity, right, right when it came out. And then, so actually, but I did write there is a revised paperback edition that came out last year that has, sort of post assassination, kind of what we
Mm.
learned. Um, and I mean, I think what the reality is, and we've certainly seen this over the past month with Ishiba, we talked about this earlier, that he, he is no longer with us, but his influence and the shadow he has cast on Japanese politics has not gone away. He continues to shape the choices that are available to Japan's leaders. I think, the foreign policy blueprint, I think, very much remains in effect. That his successors, in a lot of ways, were um, articulating, carrying forward things that he had set in motion rather than really embarking on a new course of action. And even now, I mean, even with the LDP having lost its majority, even with kind of his faction now having seen its numbers dramatically reduced, its influence in the LDP, um, all but really, if not eliminated. I mean, just nothing what it was, before. Like at the moment of his assassination, I mean, he was easily. I think he was a stronger politician at that moment than Kishida was. Even as
Yeah.
an ex prime minister, that he was incredibly powerful. And even with all of that, um, this continues to be an era shaped by the choices that he made and the agenda that he pursued. And, the notion that, um, that essentially that Japan should not just passively accept um, declining power, that Japan is and should be a great power and should be prepared to take extraordinary steps to pursue that. Um, Now Ishiba, and I have written about this, that Ishiba has essentially, I think, has a fundamentally different way of thinking about Japan, but in practice, it's not clear that he can actually act on his inclinations, and that he is essentially bound to this set of policies, um, whether he likes it or not. And so that's, I mean, that's really it's still very much Abe's LDP, even if the Abe faction is, effectively no more. It is still an LDP that will dream of achieving what he achieved, LDP dominance, kind of absolute unquestioned control of the political system, the ability to kind of pursue this national greatness agenda without really having to cede ground to anyone except maybe public opinion if it gets bad enough. Um, that will continue to be the dream, I think, that animates a lot of members of the LDP, that they are not reconciled to a more humble, modest approach to politics.
In this sense, he seems almost more like an American politician than a Japanese politician. Because I take your point, but it seems to me that no one, like, if the dream is LDP dominance and statism, like, and that certainly comes from Abe. But I don't see anybody sort of talking about the idea of Japan and the rejuvenation of Japan the way that he did. China's talking about the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation since 2013, since Xi Jinping came to power. It's almost ripping a page right out of Shinzo Abe's literal book. Like, it's literally, he was the one who was thinking about national rejuvenation and about Japan's greatness long before lots of these other countries were enacting policies to do the same sorts of things. And it's hard to imagine that you're going to get another figure that combines his unique ability to manipulate power and public opinion and find the issues that can wedge his way in and use it to break conventions in Japanese politics. And that also has this broader idea. I mean, just the scandal that has killed the LDP, or which has extinguished a lot of his compatriots, were a lot of his guys were the ones that were receiving the kickbacks. So I don't know, like, maybe they're just lost. It just seems to me that without him at the head of it, I don't know where it goes. And I sometimes, or at least after reading, I reread the book to prepare for this podcast. I have a slight, it's a really imperfect metaphor, but I was thinking about it a lot in the context of India and Narendra Modi, and how Modi has changed things for India, and when he is no longer in power, like, what the BJP will look like. And I don't know, it just feels like a similar thing with the LDP. Like, Abe is casting the shadow, but without the engine underneath it, like, eventually, like, there's going to be no substance to it. Am I being too pessimistic there?
Well, in some ways, I think maybe if we're going to analogize, he's almost a De Gaulle figure, sort of recognizing um, that in some ways global power shifts have moved against his country, but you know, through guile, through creativity, through vision, through kind of force of will, trying to make his country relevant, despite kind of the overall global power shifts. And but you look at De Gaulle's successors, and you look at that
Mhm.
he was not always the most popular figure, and kind of left power in a bit of a cloud. And there's definitely something similar to that. And in many ways, that Abe's kind of great power politics were often set against what the Japanese people themselves want. That Japan isn't. I mean, and in that way, Ishiba in many ways is probably more attuned with a lot of uh, where where the Japanese public is. That it's an aging country. It is a country that does not hunger for glory. This is not a country that's hungering for national greatness. I think they want security, and it was, I think, extremely interesting the way in which the LDP leadership election really laid bare the division, where you had Takaichi, Abe's lieutenant, who wants to, really wanted to preserve and maintain and strengthen his vision. Talking, her platform was entirely about power and building Japan's power and maintaining Japan's power. And Ishiba was all about security and providing social security and providing just in defending the country. And it's a much more um, I mean, ultimately, protecting something is a much more modest goal than empowering something. And I mean, there's a real difference, and I think that is much closer to where the the public is, and that's, I mean, and that often explains why Abe ended up being such a controversial figure domestically, because he ultimately was trying to do things that the public ultimately did not necessarily want, did not really want to play at great power politics, did not necessarily see Japan's power in and of itself as something good and worth pursuing. That ultimately, ensuring national prosperity, ensuring that, sort of peace and stability are good things. But beyond that, that the pursuit of great power was not um, is not a charity, is not, if you're a retiree in some depopulating town in the countryside, is this what you're concerned about? Not really. And so in that sense, he was sort of out of step, or really pushing back against maybe the tide.
Yeah, and to your point, it's not like he was assassinated and then there was a groundswell of sympathy or support for the LDP to push through his unfinished business. It was kind of like, okay, here's Kishida and here's a caretaker, and support rates for the government actually went down. So to your point, a very controversial and ambiguous figure in Japanese politics in and of itself. Tobias, it's been great to have you on. Is there anything I have not asked you about or pointed out that we should tell the listeners, or do you think that this is a good place to end this particular
I
chapter?
No, I think we've captured the moment, and there are clearly um, history is in motion, and it's difficult to say how exactly the next 6 or 12 months in Japan are going to go, which is somewhat unusual. We're definitely at an unusual moment. Um, so I think we can leave it there, and maybe we'll talk again as events unfold.
That sounds great to me if we haven't scared you away too much. So thanks for taking the time, and we'll let you go. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.